My name is Mark Clark, and I'm an extension specialist with the University of Florida IFAS. And we're going to take you on a tour today through a model development in Central Florida that has great ways to minimize impacts on Florida's groundwater, surface water, and the natural environment. That's good.
River Forest is a 25-acre site that has pine flatwoods, scrub ecosystem, and also it borders the Braden River, which is a very productive estuary here in Manatee County, and Williamson's Creek. Our idea was to develop a place for people to live in the same environment where already existed the plant and animal communities. In the typical Florida development, a big retention pond is dug, and then the fill is used to create mounds that the houses all go on. And then the idea is that stormwater is channelized from those mounds to the streets, to elaborate curb and gutter systems, and the water is channelized back to the retention pond. What we've done here is tried to pay attention to the way stormwater naturally soaks into the ground. We have done our best to minimize impervious surfaces in river forest.
Stormwater runoff is a major concern throughout Florida. It results from increased impervious surface areas due to development. So tell me a little bit about the road surface here. It's much narrower than most typical roadways, even in small residential areas.
Well, it's an 18-foot roadway, and it's the standard's 24 foot.
This narrower road means less impervious surface area, which means when we have a rain event, there's a lot less that runs off the landscape. So we benefit by a traffic calming device, a much more intimate sort of setting, plus we've got less runoff, which is of course what one of the real critical issues is. We have less impervious surface, but we still have runoff from the street. And the street runoff goes through this little buffered zone and down into this depression in these folks' yards here. And eventually we'll end up filling up during a storm event. What happens to the water then?
Well, two things happen. The stormwater soaks into the ground naturally, just as it would have ordinarily if this were just a forest.
And helps to recharge that groundwater, basically.
There are these sand filter underdrains. And what happens underneath this mulch is a very fine sand filter material that the water soaks down through, and then through a piece of fabric that's wrapped around a perforated pipe.
In addition to the water that's coming off the road surface, there's of course some contaminants that come as well, nutrients perhaps, and maybe some heavy metals. But as the water moves through that soil, we're actually able to filter some of that water and trap those contaminants on the surface. So as the water moves through the soil, and I see you've got actually a underdrain here indicating indeed where this pipe system is underground, that'll be cleaner water that moves into that pipe system and then eventually that goes out to the river. The real key is there's 22 of these in the subdivision. So we have lots of little retention basins all throughout the landscape, really the way the natural system would be functioning. In many driveways, we have impervious surface area that's about 100%, similar to this concrete surface area. But what's different about this particular home is the permeable pavers that they've used as part of their driveway. So instead of water that otherwise would be hitting this surface and 100% of it running off, we've got an opportunity for water to infiltrate right down into the subsoil. So there's a lot less runoff from this sort of permeable pavement, and yet still provides a nice driveway surface. They've allowed for the grass to grow up through some of these open spaces, and it actually looks like their front yard. As somebody would back up in this area, they wouldn't compact the soil quite as bad.
That's right. Just pull in the car here.
In this area, this is another one of those bioretention areas. A little more wooded, not quite as manicured, but still a nice buffer for the house.
That's right. That's right. We try to break up the trees from the houses so that
So we've got another example of an alternative type of driveway here, and this is actually shell. How much does this cost?
Well, you know, this is mined here locally, so this is really the cheapest driveway that you can come up with.
So basically we've got an alternative here, cheaper than concrete, cheaper than asphalt. It reduces runoff, we improve water quality, we benefit the Florida landscape, and we benefit the aquifer. Can't beat that. So we've also got some lovely landscaping here with native plants, some lantana here, and this really helps with the irrigation. We really have species here that tolerate drought conditions or are much more tolerant, so we don't have to irrigate quite so much.
And they're very attractive. They tend not to overgrow the landscape if they're planted well and planted in the right place. So it's a very attractive way to handle the landscape.
So you can actually enjoy it instead of having to maintain it the whole time.
That's right, is enjoy the landscape. That's what we're all about.
That sounds like a wise thing to be doing. One of the really nice things they've done here at River Forest is actually fit the home site into the landscape and had a minimal amount of tree removal and vegetation removal. And that really benefits because you preserve as much of the native landscape as you can. You preserve the trees that oftentimes may be 20, 30, 40 years old, and trying to start with new trees, you'd have half a lifetime spent waiting for those trees to provide that same canopy cover.
I'm Jerry Owens, and I live in the River Forest community. In our particular home, we've left trees all the way around it, so we're shaded probably 80% of the day. Our utility bills are kept to a minimum with a canopy of trees. That is a big savings right there. My wife has a butterfly garden, so we're kind of against the pesticides there because of the caterpillars that we're trying to grow for the butterflies. Fertilizer is pretty much limited to the ornamentals that I have, a few hanging staghorns and my bromeliads that are in pots. The rest of the vegetation, we try to keep it natural and try to keep the fertilization away from it.
There's a lot of compaction that can occur around the building site in the process of development. By preserving that natural area and keeping heavy equipment off, you actually improve your water quality and water infiltration because you're not compacting those soils.
I take a lot of pride in what we're achieving here. I feel like I'm part of the solution of keeping some of this beautiful Florida landscape pristine or in a semi-pristine state, and that there's beautiful creeks and rivers that are running around here, and I know that these yards and the way we're building and not putting too much pavement down is keeping the runoff down where the pesticides and the fertilizers aren't running off into the river. You know, building in this neighborhood it might take a little more supervision because the subcontractors and the material suppliers aren't used to being so careful around trees and some of the things that you got to watch when you're building here. But once you start doing it, there's really not a whole lot of difference in cost between building in a neighborhood like this and building in a more traditional environment.
Our infrastructure costs were about the same as you would typically have in a development. Interestingly enough, you still have to have the loaders into that in a conventional development would dig big ponds, but here they were doing very particular work and very careful work among the trees. So it took the same amount of time and cost about the same. One of the things that's interesting, though, is that by avoiding the conventional retention pond, which would have been down by the river, we were able to develop a couple of more really nice lots along the river. So we were creating value by doing the innovative development work.
So this boardwalk leads us down to the river, which is really the gem that we're trying to protect. Very intact habitat here in Central Florida, and so all of your great efforts up there in the river forest development to try to minimize stormwater runoff and improve water quality is here to protect this river system down at the end of this boardwalk.
And the idea really is that we make a connection in our minds between the physical environment where we live and the rest of the natural environment, and a connection that we enjoy.
River Forest provides a nice example of how stormwater management can be done throughout the landscape. More conventionally, though, water is collected from that landscape and channeled to the bottom of the subdivision or the area and collected into a stormwater retention or detention basin. We're going to go to an area on the University of Florida campus that really provides an alternative design that enhances the ecological function of those retention and detention basins. We're on the University of Florida campus in Gainesville, and this is a pretty typical stormwater management design where we've got curb and gutter and street surfaces. Water that runs off during a storm event typically is directed towards storm drains such as this. Most people think these actually go to some sort of a treatment facility, but they don't. Most of these actually end up in our rivers, streams, oceans, and even groundwater. This is where the water goes after it goes down that storm drain, and it enters into a stormwater retention or detention basin. Stormwater management is very important to protect our homes and downstream areas from flooding. It's also important to protect the environment from those impacts of the impervious surfaces we put in the landscape. We're going to take a look at an innovative design that actually takes those stormwater retention, detention basins and enhances them to provide multiple functions. This is where the water we've been following travels to. This basin used to be one of those conventional designs, but 8 years ago it was enhanced by changing the contour and bringing in native vegetation to make for a wetland setting. It's hard to believe we're in the middle of a stormwater retention basin. This has actually been designed to act as a wetland. If you want to consider an alternative design, you really need to think of two things. Number one, we have to have a lot of contouring in the basin. Lots of differences in topography provide for different hydrologic regimes. Number two is to bring in native vegetation that can use that landscape, and soon you'll have a mosaic of vegetation that provides habitat and a lot of aesthetic appeal. If you're interested in these sorts of enhanced designs, contact your local county extension office. One of the things we face in Florida as development continues is the loss of a lot of habitat like wetlands. These alternative designs actually provide a wonderful opportunity to offset some of those impacts while mitigating for our stormwater runoff.
I think there is an unmet need in the market, that there is an eagerness for other ways of doing things. Does the conventional way of handling stormwater with the big retention ponds and then the mounds of earth and the compacting the soil and not having any real topsoil in the whole subdivision because it's all dug out of the bottom of a lake, is that really the best way to do things? Sometimes it might make perfect sense, but in others, maybe we can do better. And I think it's the developers who can lead the way in thinking of new ways to do things.
At present, a lot of the local code and local mechanisms to develop are really out of sync with this sort of development. There really needs to be a lot more infrastructure, including a lot of code and alternative design opportunities. It's really a comprehensive effort that has to change. A lot of communities and municipal and regulatory agencies need to rethink how we're actually developing Florida. There are more than 17 million people that call Florida their home, with almost 1,000 new arrivals every day. We all tend to think as individuals and that our individual choices don't have much of an impact. But in reality, our collective actions can have a significant positive or negative effect on our environment. Whether you're a homeowner, a developer, politician, or landscaper, even the small choices you make today can make a big difference in Florida's land and water resources.